because the other one, of course, is legislation, federal legislation, to help crack down on these farm protesters, vegans and animal rights activists who have been storming onto farms and piggeries, are going basically onto private property, stop people going about their business. I mean, in the end, I think we'd expect Labor to support that too, wouldn't we? Yet they're holding out for amendments and expressing some concerns.
Well, I just don't understand at all. I mean, the proposal's quite straightforward. If you use a carriage service to incite trespass, then potentially you can be jailed for up to 5 years. I think it's eminently reasonable. I mean, some of these organisations are very large agricultural producers. Their hygiene in particular is just so critical. You imagine if these protesters track Panama disease, for example, into a banana plantation that didn't previously have it. They grower and all of their employees are simply then out of business. So, we look at the Bob Brown experience, Chris, I think. I mean, if this was Bob Brown affected directly, if these activists were kicking down his kitchen door to pinch his poodle, well, I'm sure he'd have a problem with it. But the reality is we need to ensure that our growers and our producers are protected from this type of activism. These people are vegan terrorists. They have no concern for the producers of this country and their staff. And I think that we are doing the right thing with this legislation, and we need the states to crack down as well.
Do you think maybe Labor's objections are driven by the union movement? The union movement's obviously been heavily involved in a lot of protests over the years, still involved in a lot of the protests against various developments. Maybe unions are worried that they'll get caught up in this sort of incitement law.
I mean, there's a state Labor MP up my way, Chris, the member for Maryborough, who's publicly stated that he's proud to be a union thug. Now, I don't think those sort of people should be in Parliament. You should always operate lawfully, like every other business and organisation and individual has to. Clearly, Mr Albanese doesn't have control of the Labor caucus. They are very, very much split after the last election. I mean, you've only got to look at the backpedalling from Richard Marles in recent days, where he's now a supporter of the coal industry, where previously he said that thermal coal in particular was finished.
Well, speaking about coal, what on earth is going to happen in your home state of Queensland when we have these continuing protests? Today, a concrete in business trying to go about its lawful daily work had trucks blockaded. We're told that as we speak, some protesters have chained themselves to facilities at Abbots Point. I mean, these people believe they're on a mission from Gaia to try and stop a coal mine, and they are just deliberately flaunting the law. They're deliberately stopping people going about their business. What needs to be done here? I would have thought the current laws are adequate to try and penalise these people, but it's not happening.
Chris, the deceased and dearly departed father-in-law was a lifelong police officer, famous for the use of his size 10 boot. Now, I know that's not the appropriate response, and people have a democratic right to protest. But they shouldn't be shutting down law-abiding and legitimate businesses. I mean, you look at a concrete business. The delivery of those trucks is critical. They could potentially lose the truck itself, the job, which is waiting for concrete, or halfway through a pour. It could literally cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and for some purported link to a project in central Queensland. I mean, get yourself out into the regions and have a look at how this all happens. I'll guarantee you every single one of those protesters arrived in a bus or a plane or a car or a bike made from Australian resources. It's a proud industry. It's rightfully proud of what it does, and it's got my 100% support.
The trouble with all this is the unanimity that drives it, right? Now, of course, the protesters have to be responsible for their own actions. They're adults, and I would argue that the full force of the law needs to be applied to them more forcefully so that they're dissuaded or prevented from doing this again. But this culture that we're developing, this political culture that we're developing in our schools, our universities, our public broadcasters, some of our politicians, that there's a climate crisis, that there's a climate emergency. We've got local governments declaring climate emergency. I mean, it's just encouraging everybody to believe that there is some sort of imperative to stop development, to stop energy use. I mean, it's an absurdity. The facts never seem to get much of a run in any of this.
Chris, I got some advice on the weekend. I've got to confirm it yet. That actually, the police and others provide support to these individuals by providing them shade and a drink of water and all of the niceties of life. I just don't think that's the right approach. If you want to strap yourself down to the local bridge or interrupt what's happening in a legitimate business in the sun without shade, well, that's just unfortunate. I just don't think that we should be supporting this type of protest. It's wrong. But we know that the Queensland Labor government in particular, they won't crack down on this. They have no interest in doing it. They're far too tied to the left and to the Greens and to everybody else that thinks protests are the way to get an outcome. The Australian people spoke very clearly at the last election. They were supportive of the position that we put forward. I think these arguments are finished. They absolutely rejected Labor's position, and I think we need to get on with being in government and doing the things that we committed to.
But don't we also need to make sure that the debate is much more sensible, that people aren't frightened, that children, teenagers aren't frightened, that we explain that none of the climate changes have gone anywhere near the alarmist modelling predictions, that global action, if it wanted to, could dramatically reduce emissions by switching to nuclear power, that the Adani coal mine will lift far more people out of poverty than it's going to harm. All these useful bits of factual information that don't seem to get much of a run.
Chris, the level of anxiety, particularly in the younger generation, I've just found to be terrible. It's really difficult. As a parent with young kids, the sort of thing that's been put to them effectively, that the world will catch on fire and the earth is looking at a terrible outcome, which in my view is just wrong. We need to adjust and adapt, as we have done many times as a species. But once again, mate, what do we do with these people? They've been allowed to run off on their agenda on a very narrow focus. I don't think it's based on facts, and I think you make a really good point around the nuclear debate. I mean, I've been trying fairly hard over recent weeks and months to convince the Labor Party in particular to get on board and have a non-partisan discussion about something which is a difficult issue, but it may well be in the best interest of the nation in the future. But to do that, we need to have that frank and adult conversation, and to date, they don't seem too interested.
Yeah, it's an amazing issue. I was laughing last week, I think it was, the ABC saying they don't like the economics of nuclear, but they're happy to waste money subsidising renewables that don't work. I mean, if you're going to pay a premium to reduce emissions, obviously at least nuclear power is reliable as compared to renewables. But there we go. Logic doesn't seem to stack up too much in this debate. Thanks so much for joining us, Keith. Appreciate it.